Welcome. This is a review for all the wonderful Laguna Middle School students for Chapter 20, America Becomes a World Power. This is Mrs. Vujovich-La Barre, hoping that you study often and early on this wonderful part of United States history. Which of the following factors was not behind the growth of imperialism from the late 1870s to 1914? The desire of a nation to become culturally diverse by attracting new immigrants. Until the late 1800s, U.S. foreign policy was isolationist, which means it avoided involvement in affairs with other countries. Why did Senator Henry Cabot Lodge argue against American isolationism? He believed in promoting economic expansion through naval power. Which territory was annexed by the United States mainly because of its economic importance? Hawaii. What was Hawaii's leading export in the 1840s? Sugar. Why did the McKinley Tariff cause Hawaii's economy to collapse in the 1890s? It paid a subsidy to U.S. sugar producers who increased domestic sugar production, which caused Hawaiian sugar prices to decrease. How would you characterize Japan's foreign policy up to the mid-1800s? Isolationist. What motivated the Japanese to sign a commercial treaty with the United States in 1858? They were urged with gifts and the threat of military force. What was the open door policy? An American statement that all nations should have equal access to trade in China. All of the following factors contributed to the Boxer Rebellion, except which? Poor treatment of foreigners by Chinese leaders. What term identifies the practice of exaggerating news stories in order to sell newspapers? Yellow journalism. Which statement best describes how the conflict between Cuba and Spain was covered in the American press in 1897? It was exaggerated because two New York newspapers were competing for readers, and their publishers knew that threats of war would sell newspapers. By 1898, how did most Americans feel about taking military action against Spain? Supportive. What was the significance of the explosion of the Maine to Americans? It rallied Americans against Spain, though Spain may not have been responsible. What was the Teller Amendment? A statement by Congress saying the United States had no interest in taking control of Cuba. Who was Emilio Aguinaldo? He was a Filipino rebel leader who took control of the Philippine capital, Manila, with the help of U.S. reinforcements. The peace treaty between the United States and Spain following the Spanish-American War placed all of these countries under U.S. control, except which? Haiti. Why did some Americans from the Anti-Imperialist League after the Spanish-American War? I'm going to read that again. Why did some Americans form the Anti-Imperialist League after the Spanish-American War? They believed the U.S. was trying to build a colonial empire. Part of the Cuban Constitution, the Platt Amendment, limited Cuba's right to make treaties and increased the ability of the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs. Theodore Roosevelt stated, I believe we should build the Central American Canal at once, and in the meantime, we should build a dozen new battleships. What does this comment show about President Roosevelt's views? Roosevelt believed naval power was important to U.S. security and strength. Which of the following was an indirect result of Colombian Senate's rejection of the Hay-Haran Treaty? President Roosevelt considered military methods for acquiring Panama. Which of the following was not an obstacle to building the Panama Canal? The threat of Panamanian revolt. What was the Roosevelt corollary? In addition to the Monroe Doctrine that warned South American nations that the United States would get involved if they didn't behave and repay their loans. Why did President Roosevelt propose the Roosevelt corollary? European nations were considering using force to collect debts from South American nations. What was the Monroe Doctrine? A warning to European nations not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. Who came up with the idea of dollar diplomacy? William Howard Taft. Dollar diplomacy was a type of American foreign policy that sought to influence Latin American governments through economic rather than military intervention. How were dollar diplomacy and the Roosevelt corollary different? The first used business to solve problems, the second used force. What statement matches Woodrow Wilson's view on the role of the United States in Latin America? The United States should meet its moral obligation to promote democracy. Which of these statements about Woodrow Wilson is true? He sent more troops into Latin America than any president before him. How were Presidents Wilson, Taft, and Roosevelt similar? None of them allowed unrest in Latin America to threaten U.S. interests there. During the rule of which Mexican leader did America become the biggest investor in Mexico? Porfirio Diaz. More than 120,000 Mexicans immigrated into the United States from 1905 to 1915 for all of the following reasons, except which? To buy cheaper property. What was the cause of the Mexican Revolution? The harsh rule of a dictator. Who was Francisco Madero? A democratic reformer who began the Mexican Revolution. The Mexicans who fled to the United States between 1905 and 1915 came from what level or levels of Mexican society? They came from all classes. Who was Victoriano Huerta? The Mexican general who took power in 1913. How did Woodrow Wilson respond to the violence that followed the Mexican Revolution? With military force. What were the ABC powers? The countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, which offered to negotiate the dispute between the United States and Mexico. Who led the revolt against Victoriano Huerta? Venustiano Carranza. How is the Mexican Revolution best characterized? A successful attempt to overthrow a dictator is followed by another dictatorship. That concludes the study session for Chapter 20 before America becomes a world power. Study early, study often. Good luck.